Salt and Sanctuary is a 2D Metroidvania inspired by Dark Souls. Personally, it fits in the space between Dark Souls 1 and 2 as a sort of unofficial Dark Souls 1.5. I played through the game on the new Enhanced Combat mode, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about still applies to the Classic mode. The changes in the Enhanced Combat mode is mostly on weapon rebalancing. There are a few other changes here and there, but it still plays the same as the Classic mode. There are two things that I feel like I need to point out about how the game is presented. The first is the audio. The sound effects are pretty much what you would expect and aren't too out of the ordinary. The music, on the other hand, has an interesting choice. The music that plays when in rest areas is nice and calming. And the boss music has this anxious and tense feeling to it. Which is exactly what you would expect. The music that I do find strange is the stuff that plays when you're out exploring areas. For the most part, there isn't any music playing at all, and it's just the ambience of the area you're in. Then, almost out of nowhere, it just starts creeping in, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting it the first time I heard it either. The songs that play while exploring are more what I would expect from a game set in a zombie apocalypse. Sorry, a modern zombie apocalypse. The other thing is that the art style of the game is intentionally ugly. The humanoid characters are all somewhat off-putting. I feel like this really helps nail down the bleak and depressing feeling the island has going for it, and that's without having to describe the more monstrous-looking enemies. A lot of the enemy designs are what one would expect, like zombies and overgrown wildlife. But there's also a bunch of enemies that are influenced by either body or cosmic horror as well on the island, and none of this feels too out of place. Going back to character creation, you aren't given much information about what anything does. The only choices that matter are the class, the starting item, challenges, and if you're playing the classic version or the new enhanced combat. The rest of the choices are just purely cosmetic. There are 8 classes to choose from, and 6 of them are based around a primary stat like strength, dexterity, or magic. The other 2 are the blank slate choices. For the most part, the classes are either focused on offense or defense with their preferred stat, but in the long run, picking a class just decides where your starting talents are. There are only 2 things I feel like I need to point out about class selection. The first is that the mage is the way to go if you want to shoot lightning. Prayers, the holy magic in this game, is mostly focused on healing and some defensive buffs. The other thing is that the chef class is considered more of a joke class. There's a reason that one of the challenges is using just the frying pan as your only weapon. As for the starting items, there are 3 of them that I think are more useful than the others from the choices you have. The grasping ring gives extra salt when killing enemies, which helps with leveling and improving equipment. The Amber Idol allows you to transmute a weapon into a more powerful one earlier than normal. Then there's the Stone Sellsword, which is used for the local co-op with a second player. All of the items that you are offered here can be found while exploring or from killing enemies. There isn't really anything you're missing out on from just skipping them altogether. The choice of what item you take is more on what you want from the early game. The challenges are there to add additional difficulty. And they're things like not being able to heal or no blocking. I personally don't care for any of them, but they are there in the game as options for those who need or want an extra challenge. There are a few differences in how the weapons are balanced depending on which combat mode you pick. In the classic combat mode, there are 3 weapon choices that are in a league of their own. The two-handed sword, magic staff, and two-handed mace and axe builds are powerful enough that you really don't have to worry about much else. And this is just for purely focusing on one of the 3 weapon types. I feel like the changes made in the enhanced combat mode to the weapon scaling has made the other builds more in line with the old top 3. There's also a difference in how many talent points each skill class needs, but I really didn't notice that outside of having more choices in where to put the extra talent points. Even with the changes in the enhanced mode, there are still some balance issues I have with the game. Like, sometimes you just need a can opener for armored enemies. They did make it easier for you to get your hands on a blunt weapon for those occasions, but it does feel more like a band-aid on the problem than an actual solution. I think that the core of this problem is because of how your choice in equipment is tied to what talents you have chosen. There are still some issues that carried over from the previous versions, like heavy armor is still only useful for dressing up as a potato, prayers are only good for healing, and aiming ranged weapons is still wonky. The other big change the enhanced mode made is how whips deal damage. If you hit an enemy with the tip of the whip, it does more damage. That is a neat change that forces you to care more about your spacing with the enemies. I did a playthrough with the game with 3 different builds to check out most of the changes. One was with one of the old powerful builds, another with a prayer build, and a build that focused on whips. Not saying I'm an expert at this game, it's just I have a problem. Once you arrive on the island, there's an old man who comments on your sorry situation and asks you about your religion. So you just know you're in for a good time here. You need to pick one of the 3 choices he offers because it ties into how the Sanctuaries work. The first is the 3. It's the middle ground of the 3 choices, not really favoring a playstyle. Next up is Devara's Light, which focuses on holy magic. The last choice is the Iron Ones, which is best suited for melee and ranged playstyles. The choice of creed doesn't matter too much because you can change which one you belong to, and there are other creeds to join if you don't care for any of the starting choices. You just need to find a different one first, and there are some downsides to leaving a creed, but that depends on how devout you are. You can rest at sanctuaries claimed by other creeds as long as you don't offend them, but you will only get your base amount of goodies from them. There are 2 types of checkpoints, sanctuaries and shrines. The sanctuaries are where you level up, spend talent points, and make offerings. Sanctuaries also act as warp points to different areas you've been before. Each creed has their own version of restorative items, and they all function a little differently than the others. You can get more items from resting by either investing in certain talents or by proving yourself to your chosen creed. The shrines are smaller rest areas usually found before boss fights. In addition to the usual benefits of resting, you also receive the items you would normally get from your chosen creed when resting at a shrine. When you make an offering to your creed at the sanctuary, you hand over a statue to summon a villager. You can summon up to 4 in each sanctuary, and on top of the services they provide, they also give the area a small buff, like increasing item drops or reducing magic damage. Increasing your devotion to a creed is done by turning in items to the leader. The items you need to give are body parts that drop from the normal enemies found exploring the island. Your reward for showing devotion to a creed is merchants expanding their inventories, and you get to pick one of 4 items to add to what you receive from resting at your creed sanctuary or at a shrine. There are 2 villagers that improve your gear, the blacksmith and the alchemist. The blacksmith upgrades weapons and armor up to 7 times. Alchemists transmute equipment into different tiers of the same item type. When transmuting an item, it loses 1 rank of its upgrade, so an item upgraded to rank 4 will become rank 3. This is a bit annoying, especially when your new weapon needs an upgrade material you don't have, but the change is usually worth it. Leveling up has you trade in salt for a small boost to your maximum health and black pearls to spend on talents. The talent tree itself is rather large and can be a bit much to take in when starting out. The talents all have a bit of background lore and are split into 3 different types: class skills, stat points, and extra recovery items. The class skills are for what weapons, spells, or armor you want to specialize in. There's a difference in the cost of skills based on which combat mode you choose. In Classic, the cost and level are the same. A level 4 skill would cost 4 pearls. And in the Enhanced mode, the cost increases on every odd level. A level 4 skill would cost 2 pearls. The class skills also give a stat boost based on the amount of pearls spent to acquire the skill. Stat point nodes are the links in between the class skills. Strength, Dexterity, Magic, and Wisdom are for scaling weapon or spell damage. Each stat node can have up to 5 points put in them until you beat the game once on that character. Then you can put in as many as you want. I never found it necessary to put multiple pearls into a stat node, but the option is there if you want to focus on what you already have instead of branching out. Endurance and willpower are the only stats that don't scale weapons. Endurance increases your equipment load, and willpower increases stamina and drop rates. The combat is as close as you can get to Dark Souls in a 2D game. You have a light and heavy attack, can block, parry, and cast spells. The big difference in combat comes from being expected to jump out of the way of some attacks in addition to the dodge roll. There's also some combo attacks, and they aren't too difficult to pull off. Most of them are just a sequence of light and heavy attacks, but there are a few that need a directional input as well. I need to dip into the game's user interface for a bit in terms of how it works with the game's combat. As a whole, the options for the UI has everything you would expect to be there. The problems with the interface come from what it doesn't explain. For example, the health and stamina bars are both instantly recognizable here, but do you notice that tiny bar on the end of the stamina bar? That's for your mana. If you take enough damage, your maximum health will decrease. While out and about, the only way to regain your maximum health is through the healing prayers. Casting spells or prayers causes you to lose your maximum stamina and mana. Restoring both stamina and mana is done through the consumable items you get from either talents or devotion to your creed. Resting at a shrine or sanctuary always restores everything back to the maximum. Losing some of your maximum health is not as crippling as it sounds because it's usually from taking big hits or damage from debuffs like poison or fire. I feel like the loss of maximum health is just to stop people from tanking every hit. When looking at your equipment, if a piece of armor has a red X over it, you won't be able to equip it. Weapons are a bit different. If a weapon only has a single slash over it, that means you can equip it, but only be able to swing the weapon effectively with two hands. Having some indication that a weapon could be used two-handed in the inventory is something I wish Dark Souls did. Your equipment load depends on what armor you have on and the weapons you currently have out instead of the total of everything you have equipped. Swapping between the two weapon sets can change your encumbrance and the speed of your dodge roll and movement speed. This lets you have the choice of having one light weapon set to quickly dodge attacks and another heavier weapon set for blocking. Spells in the game are split into two different skill trees, prayers and magic. Your basic magic spells are equipped to wands or staves in the same way as ammo for ranged weapons. Incantations and prayers are equipped to the quick item menu and are cast the same way you would use an item. The prayers kinda feel like an afterthought. Outside of healing, the prayers are for buffing and removing debuffs. But there are items that do pretty much the same thing, and since spells reduce your maximum stamina, the trade-off just doesn't seem worth it most of the time. There are 3 offensive prayers. 2 of them feel like a poor imitation of their magic counterparts. The last one is a fairly powerful summon spell in its own right, but you can only cast it once you max out the prayer skill. For the magic spells, you need to be aware of the elemental imbalance between fire and lightning. Casting spells of one element fills up the bar at the top of the screen, and you take damage if you fill up either side. Reducing the elemental imbalance is done in one of 3 ways. You can simply wait for the bar to empty, cast spells of the other element, or equip a ring to negate the imbalance altogether. The biggest problem I have with the combat is how everything's tied into your talent choices, determining what you can equip instead of your stats. The weapons you're able to use could all be bladed weapons when you could really use a blunt one instead. This ties into why some of the two-handed weapons were the most powerful in the classic mode. Having the talents to wield two-handed swords, axes, or maces covers both of the physical damage types. While this doesn't make fights impossible, they can make fights drag on long enough that you could end up making too many mistakes and end up getting dragged back to a sanctuary. There are some weapons that don't need talents to equip, and weapon modifiers that add different damage types to a weapon to try and get around this problem. I just find that the talent tree makes you want to specialize your character, and then a boss or tough enemy just punishes you for not having a more well-rounded build. The island itself is rather large, and you can walk from one end of it to the other without having to warp from one place to another. If you need to get to some place you've been before, you have a bunch of different ways of getting there via teleportation. So there isn't any long treks out of a pit unless you really want to hoof it. There's no in-game map, which for a Metroidvania seems like an insane choice to make, and is another detriment to the game by following the Dark Souls formula a bit too closely. Each area you visit feels like its own contained level for the most part. While there are different shortcuts and paths to other areas, most of them are just looping back to places you've already been. The shortcuts also don't feel all that useful with the ability to teleport to sanctuaries you've already visited. The alternate paths mostly feel like they're just there to give you equipment or other items. Sometimes you'll wander into areas that are almost pitch black. There are different ways to keep the darkness at bay, with the simplest way being a torch. Each method to illuminate an area all have their own downside. Just be careful exploring these darker areas because sometimes there's nothing there. Other times, what is there wants your salt. There's also one enemy in particular that consumes light, which is a neat mechanic, but I don't feel like they're being used in any real interesting way. The transitions between doors is the biggest problem I have with exploring. The area you are moving into isn't visible until you pass through the doorway. Most of the time it isn't really a problem, but there is one area that is really bad. There's no way to know that there's a pit there, and you're just going to end up falling to your doom. This is the only place in the game where a door just drops you into a pit like this, and it just feels like a cheap way to kill the player. When exploring the island, it rarely feels like you have any options in choosing where to go. But I am willing to admit that I have my preferred path through the island ingrained into my skull at this point. The beginning of the game is fairly linear and only has a few optional bosses. The first split in the path you have to take in the game is just picking which boss you want to fight. There's nothing stopping you from fighting both bosses, and there isn't really any big reward for fighting both. The second split is kind of hidden, and it's mostly due to the level design. The first time you go through the area where the second path starts, you probably aren't going to notice it because the path is over a pit. The platforming in the level is funneling you towards the boss, and you're missing the ability to even cross the pit. Even after getting the ability needed to cross the gap, I honestly forget there's a path there until I'm running back through from the other side. The only thing that changes from taking one path in the second split over the other is what order you get your movement abilities in. The abilities you get to help traverse the island are interesting, mostly in a lore way, but I feel like they aren't used that well as game mechanics. I feel like the abilities are used more as keys to unlock progress and less as ways to get around. Most of the abilities you get are tied directly into the level design in a way that feels like the island demands that you use them. Only one of them is useful in combat situations, and it's just another way to avoid enemies or attacks. Enemies feel like they are as smart as they need to be. They will run into traps and go flying off ledges at times, but some of them will start running away from you when you become the scariest thing in the room. Most areas have one or two enemies that make me pause for a second to stop and think about how I will handle fighting them. These are usually the bigger enemies because they can easily send you flying, or the ones that can grab you and pin you down. Seriously, I'm terrified of a decrepit dress mannequin just because one of its moves is impaling you and giving you a good twist. There's a nice variety in the different bosses you fight. They range from your typical dude in armor to mythical beast and whatever this thing is. Fighting them is the typical dance that Dark Souls has where you dodge until it's safe to smack them. Besides a few bosses feeling unpredictable in how they fight, and by that I mean sometimes they're a joke to fight one time and an unstoppable killing machine the next time. They each have 3 phases to them, and for the most part each phase just speeds up the time in between their attacks. There are 2 problems I have with the way that boss fights play out. The first is that it makes me try and min-max my character builds into a glass cannon no matter what I'm trying to do with them. The other is that it rarely feels like the fight changes from beginning to end. A lot of the boss fights just turn into this chaotic mess at the end of it. I feel like the only boss that makes a good use of the 3 different phases is the first one. The boss has a visible change in appearance, and it feels more like they're chaining their moves together instead of spamming attacks with a lower cooldown. Instead of leaving pools of shame when you lose all your health, one of 3 things happens depending on how you met your fate. If you succumb to poison or fall into a pit, a salt bat will spawn near where you spent your last moments. The salt bat acts in the same way that the regular bat enemies do, but when you defeat it you regain all of your lost salt. If you meet your demise at the hands of a regular enemy, they absorb all your salt. The enemy gets a buff and you've basically made your own mini-boss. Bosses also absorb your salt after losing to them, but you only need to damage the boss a certain amount to regain what you have lost. There's a nice challenge to regaining what you have lost at times. Of course, if you get dragged back to the Sanctuary a second time without reclaiming your salt, it is gone forever. You also lose 10% of your current gold when getting dragged back to a Sanctuary. Gold isn't really hard to come by, and unless you're trying to buy some of the most expensive items in the game, you really don't need all that much. Outside of buying equipment or supplies, the best thing to spend gold on is more salt. There are some reoccurring NPCs in the game. Some of them have quests and add to the game's overall plot a bit. Most of the people you run into either have a quest line or help you get around the island, sometimes both. The quest lines are just find the person, exhaust their dialogue, and sometimes they will ask you a question. Finding them can be a problem because they can be hidden in some out-of-the-way spots. They also disappear until the next cycle if you defeat the area's boss without talking to them, which is annoying. To be honest, I don't find the story of this game to be all that interesting. The world's lore is told in the typical Dark Souls fashion, where every item and each talent has a description that tells a bit about the world and its history. It's just that I think the NPCs you run into are more interesting than the lore, and it's basically only in one facet. That is, trying to figure out how long they've been on the island. There are a few of the NPCs that hint at being on the island a long time. So long that this might not be their first trip around in a sense of game progression. New Game Plus is exactly the same as the first time around, but the enemies have more health and higher defenses. The only real problem I found with adjusting to starting all over is the loss of your movement abilities. I don't really care for the New Game Plus, I'd rather just make a new character and start from scratch. This is an easy recommend for me. Salt and Sanctuary is sold on Steam and the Epic Games Store for $18. This is one of those games where I try and find a way to do a yearly playthrough. There's enough variety in the different builds to try, and I still enjoy coming back to play some of my favorite builds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.